Welcome, everybody. Special welcome for the people abroad for the webinar to this symposium on river basin planning and modeling. We have a program prepared for today. We expect a few people to come in a few minutes, so maybe it's a little bit crowdy if the people come in, but then you know what's going on. Special welcome also to Henny, who come here to the Netherlands, especially for this symposium, to present the results of studies in Indonesia. And for today we have, we start with a presentation of Judith de Maat about establishing integrated water resource management for river basin planning and the guidelines we prepared for that. After that, an introduction in the computational frameworks. And during the day we have several coffee breaks and lunch that will be over there in the main entrance. And I hope everybody use also that period to network, to get acquainted with each other. And then it's not only presenting the results, the purpose of this meeting, but also work together and interact with each other. Then after the first coffee break, we have a few examples of river basin planning and the use of RIBESIM in Indonesia, in Turkey, and after the lunch in Lesotho. And in between, before the lunch, we have a break for a collaborative game that will be given by Andrew Warren. And then after the lunch, I thought it was a nice idea to have first start with a group photo that will be here. So I would like to ask you to be here 2:45. And then in the afternoon we have first a presentation of Ron Paschier about application of RIBESIM in Lesotho. And after that we will present and discuss the future developments of RIBESIM, what we do here from the Netherlands at Deltares. And then finally at 5 o'clock we finish with drinks. So I hope you all have a good day today and get inspired in your working day to day, and have also a break out of the rush of all the studies you do.
Okay, like this? Yeah? Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Judith de Maat. I work at Deltares as a specialist in IWRM, Integrated Water Resources Management. I work on a global level, national plans and regional river basins plans. I'm also the program manager for our research program about information systems for water security. And today I'd like to present a framework for analysis for IWRM. First, everybody probably is familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals that was initiated by the UN. And one of the Sustainable Development Goals is number 6.5. Does someone know what this means? What the content is of this Sustainable Development Goal? Oh, no? It's about IWRM. By 2030, integrated water resources management level should be implemented at different levels, and it should stimulate transboundary cooperations. And one of the indicators is the degree of integrated water resources management implementation. So we want to move forward in the implementations of IWRM the upcoming years. There is also one other indicator is about working together, transboundary, and Marnix will tell a little bit more about it in his next presentation about the Ganges decision support modeling framework. Okay, what will be my presentation today about? First, I'd like to tell a little bit more about how to implement IWRM. One example is the framework of analysis that we developed for the World Bank in the Philippines as a guideline how to implement IWRM. And it consists of different phases, and I will guide you through these phases. And I also touch upon a little bit about how you can use modeling tools and data to support this planning. But it will be discussed in all the other presentations later today. So I will mainly focus on the framework, the steps that you take to implement IWRM. To recapture IWRM, what is it? It's a big word. It's already established in 2000 by the Global Water Partnerships, and IWRM is a process. It's not a goal, it's a process that stimulates or promotes coordinated development of management of water, land, and related resources in an integrated way, and it should benefit the economic and social welfare and promote sustainability of the ecosystems. It's also based on 4 principles. We call it the Dublin principles because they were discussed in Dublin. And one of the principles is, for example, is participatory approach. So there is definitely a place for stakeholders to be involved. They should be involved to make a good IWRM plan. But how to implement IWRM? There was a report from the Global Water Partnership in 2009. It gives you a kind of a handbook to implementation IWRM in basins, because river basins seems to be the most appropriate level, spatial level to implement these IWRM. It showed different steps and for implementation of IWRM. They are mentioned here. First of all, you need to create an enabling environment. So it should be institutionalized, stakeholders should be involved, and also the organizations. The next step is to set up a basin management organization that especially focus on the river basin, and that will will arrange the financing of the activities and involve all the stakeholders. Together, they will develop a long-term IWRM plan for the long term, and for the short term, based upon this long-term plan, what we want to accomplish, we make an action plan for the short term, what to do. And we, of course, want to monitor this plan if we have any progress and reach for our goals. And so we also have to put an information and monitoring system in place. And of course, we have to communicate about it. What are we going to do, and promote a plan to make this transition to accomplish these goals. Today, I want to focus on step 5 and 6 about the planning. And why do we have to plan? Why do we have to plan ahead, and why not just discuss measures and take some actions, but why are we going to plan ahead? Because IWRM has many actors. So we have to work together towards a common vision and goals. And we have to agree upon that, because sometimes there are conflicts of interest and so on. So we have to get them all involved and to get ownership. In most cases, there are many issues. So which are important? We can't do it all. If we have too much, we want to address too much, we never, the car is too heavy, we never go forward. So we have to make priorities. What are we going to do first? What are we going to do next? And to address these issues, we want to take measures, but which one is the best? So we have to balance the interests between the different stakeholders. And we have to come up with which one is a good action to take based on the benefits and the cost of these measures. Do we have the finance for that? Who will benefit from that? And if we want to have an effective plan, we also have to make sure what has to be done and who will be responsible. Who will take up the action? Who will take care? Who should give a permit? Who has to do the actual implementation in the field work, and so on. So we have to be clear about roles and responsibilities. And we want to, of course, have the risk, to assess the risks that are involved with this plan. So we also have to make a risk assessment. And so all these items make that we want to plan ahead. So we want to come up with an IWRM plan. A typical planning cycle that was already presented by the Global Water Partnerships look like this. Most of it starts with a vision. Where do we want to go ahead? We identify the problem, what is going on now, what is the situation now, how are we going to improve it, like a strategy. We make a plan, we implement it, we evaluate it. Are we proceeding? Is it going to be better according to our vision, where we want to go? And we go ahead. What we did in the project for the World Bank, Deltares, Global Water Partnership and IHE, is we made a framework or a planning guidelines for the Philippines. How to implement IWRM in the Philippines on the river basin river basin level. We made a manual showing all the steps to go through to come up with an effective IWRM plan. The framework looks like this, and today I will guide you through this framework. The framework consists of 5 main phases. We call it, first phase is the inception phase. It's the starting up of the project. It sets the boundary conditions for the analysis. The second phase is the situation analysis. So what is happening now and what is happening in the future when we don't do anything. The next phase is the strategy building. What measures can we take to address, to improve the situation in the water resources management system? The last 2 phases are the action planning and implementation. So we prepare the investments and start implement these measures. It's not that if we just do these 5 phases, then we are done. No, you have to realize that it's an iterative process. So it's a cycling process. So after you finish your IWRM plan, a next phase will start and you can focus more on a special area or a special problem or get other people involved and so on. It's a cycle process, and every time you proceed more. For example, in the Netherlands, we have this Dutch Delta program. We had the first phase, it took 5 years, and now we are in the second phase that again takes 5 years. And we start all over again, but now we are focusing more on hotspot areas in the Netherlands. It is important also to get the stakeholders involved and to end every stage of the project, of every phase, with a decision making or agreement upon between the stakeholders. So every phase, the stakeholders in the beginning of that phase, we start creating common level of knowledge so everybody knows what's going on and has the same information. Some stakeholders have a lot of information about their own situation, but not on the other, from the other stakeholders. And they have to get a view on what's going on also in the other sectors. And we have to exchange views and issues. So we got a common understanding about each other. And we have to elaborate also on improvements or measures that we can take and exchange ideas. In the end, we have to come up with a decision. So the third phase is the convergence. We have to select the main issues, what is the most important at the moment to address. And in the end, we have to agree upon what came out of this phase before we can move to the next phase. If we don't agree upon what is the best option to do, then we can never start implementing it. So how about the IWRM framework of analysis that we established in the Philippines? It's not a new idea or a concept. Most steps are common sense. That's most of the most what you see also about the project cycle. In a sense, it's always more or less the same. So, but the power of the framework is that we make steps explicit. So we can enable the coordination. We are clear about coordination between stakeholders. We are clear about the steps that we take. We are clear about integration, where everybody fits in, and when a decision is made. And there are different frameworks. All can be good. So if you look on the internet, there are different frameworks. But what we want to stress out is that it is important to have a systematic approach. And it doesn't matter what kind of framework it is or terminology or so, but we think it's good to have go through these steps in a systematic way. So what I present today about this framework, it's also presented in this book about water resources systems planning and management from Eelco van Beek and Daniel Lux. You can download it from the internet, and especially we focus today on chapter 13. So now I'd like to go with you into more detail about this IWRM framework. And first let's discuss the first phase. It's the inception phase at the beginning of the start of the project. So we have to get a feeling about the problem and what we want to study, what do we want to take into account in this IWRM plan. So there are 4 steps in it. Defining the analysis conditions, so what do we take into account? Enabling conditions, if we don't have the mandate to make a plan or it will be approved later on, then it's no use to start this IWRM process. And we have to set up a stakeholder process, and we have to be clear about what we want to accomplish with this plan. So when I'm thinking about creating enabling conditions, so step 1 is what I said is about it should be embedded in the institutional framework of the country or the river basin. And you have to have management instruments like data and tools to make this plan. The stakeholder process is also important. So who should be involved? So it starts with stakeholder analysis. What are the representatives? Which are the governmental organizations that are involved? Are the NGOs involved? Who are the stakeholder? Is the private sector, and in what way we want to involve them? Should they be involved like by presentations on, Or are we going to discuss build up the models? Or are we going to outsource research? Or is it just discussing? There are different ways to involve these people. And we have to be clear about what are we going to look. Is the planning ahead for 5 years? Is it for 20 years or 50 years? In the Netherlands, for example, we look at 2050, 2100. So that's far ahead. But you can imagine, for example, in Bangladesh or in the Philippines, it's no use to look at ahead for 2100. If you're studying climate change, for example, it is. But nowadays, there are already big issues, so you plan ahead for more like 20 years or so, because there's also major change going on in the countries. And you also have to be clear about economic analysis. You have to be clear about certain assumptions like discount rate and so on. So you have to specify these. And you also have to be really clear about system boundaries. Are we going to take the coastal zone also into consideration, or do we only focus on the river basin? Are we going to the neighboring country, like for example for the Ganges? Are we also taking into account Bangladesh and India, or only Bangladesh? So we have to worry about this, and how are we going to present our results? One of the most important steps in this inception phase is also defining your objectives. So what are you going to reach for? And normally it's based on national objectives. So what is the national policy? And it's not only related to water resources management, it also interact with other policies in the country. But how to judge them, we have to make them operational in water management terms. So what can we do from a water management point of view to address these topics in the country? And when are we satisfied? So what are we target for? And how can we monitor that we reach these targets? And in the end, we want to come up with a scorecard. So when will we think it's perfect? So that's in the right column. And how far are we now, and how far after? If we don't do anything, what will happen then? How are we going to accomplish this? For example, in the Sustainable Development Goals, we say, okay, we want to implement IWRM. It's now between 0 and 100% is the target, but when do we reach the 100%, and how are we going to target that we now, for example, 80% or so? For an example about these objectives, for example, the objective of the Netherlands, I showed you just a picture about flooding in the Netherlands, and for the Netherlands, the primary objective is, most important is safety. So if we get flooded, then the Netherlands had a big problem. So it's more important than fresh water supply, for example. So we think that our water system is mainly designed for managing this flooding issue. Secondary, so it's also important, but less important if we have to make decisions and we set priorities, is the drinking water supply and also supply for agricultural use or navigation. But we also think it should be fitted in an ecological system. So it's quite expensive. We have, for example, this project, Room for the River, that we want to implement, and we want to safeguard the country from flooding, but we also want to take into account the ecological consequences. So we give priority to measures that also benefit that goal. And it's different for each water resources IWRM planning study, but if you look at the different goals in different countries, you see some similarities. And we have mainly IWRM is really focusing on developing like this water resources in a way that we get maximum benefits from it for both in a social way and in an economic way. So it's not only about the water system itself, but it should in the end benefit equity, income, and so on, and also the environmental conditions. But it also it's limited, of course, by the budget that we have. So we can only spend it once, so we also have to take that one into account. You can also see you can also recognize the culture of the country. So it's really based upon the situational setting and priorities from the country. So if you look, for example, at South Africa, apartheid is really important. So you even see that back in the, you also see that in the objective of IWRM. So it should fight apartheid. So everything what is related to water management, it's really about equity and between different people all over the country. But if you look, for example, at Bangladesh, that's less an issue, and Bangladesh has a lot of problems with flooding, so they put a lot of attention in their IWRM towards flooding and safeguards to flooding, and also for food production, because the population rate is really going up. So how are we going to feed these people? And they pay a lot of attention to in their IWRM plan to these issues. But how are we going to measure this? On one hand, we're going to relate it to the water system. So how is the water system performing? Like how much water can we deliver to the irrigation area? But in the end, we want to improve the agricultural sector, or the food production. So we shouldn't stop at simulating our water system. We also should simulate the cost and benefit analysis. And in the end, to make a judgment about how can we stimulate deployment, for example. Then at the end of the first phase, we have a view about what should be the IWRM plan about and what we want to accomplish. So based on this, we can make a work plan, how to proceed and to do the next 4 steps. Yeah, okay. Then I will go quickly through the 3 steps. The first step is the situation analysis. We describe the water resources system. So, and for integrated water resource management, it's important to have the natural system, so the water system and the land resources, but don't forget about the socio-economic system. So what are the sectors that needs water, so the water demand, and also the guidance, the regulations and the management, so the institutional system. We want to describe that in an integrated approach. And we don't want to show it only for the current situation, but also for the future situation. So we have to develop scenarios looking at climate change and also on economic developments. I will change this one. So by comparing the base case, so the present situation and the future situation, we can make a description of the problem. And by making a description of the problem, we can make an inventory of measures that we can take, a long list, more or less a wish list maybe, how we can address these. I will go through this one. And I want to, we already discussed that we think it's, that the effect should be in economic effects, and also because decision makers are not only interested in physical phenomena, but also in economic phenomena. They want to know about food production instead of water levels, for example. So this is an example how the problem definition can be presented. And then after the situation analysis, we come up with the strategy building phase. The strategy building phase consists of 3 steps. Development of alternative strategies, adaptive management analysis, so how can we adapt to the future, and come up with selection with the preferred strategy. This is an example of how to structure these. So design different alternative strategies, judge what the impact of these strategies is, and compare them. Okay. For example, by comparing these alternative strategies in a scorecard, we can present it to the decision makers. And it can be on an iterative way, but also based on extensive modeling exercises. Sometimes it will be possible to express everything in cost-benefit analysis, but for example for nature it will be more difficult, and maybe it's more about a judgment for which one is the best, which one is the middle, by expert judgment. This is an example of the scorecard that I presented by the problem analysis. So we now add the strategies and see what the impact is related to our target. So how are they going to improve the situation? And then we are at the end of the strategy building phase, and we have to select the preferred option that we are going to implement. And we have to translate this preferred option of the preferred strategy into an action plan and come up with the implementation. One of the items in the action plan is the investment planning, and that's relatively, that gets more and more attention now that we see in the scientific world also. It's more about financing, how to finance all these measures and take them into account as soon as possible to make also really an effective plan. So that we are clear about what we are going to do, who is going to do it, how are we going to do it, when, and where is the money coming from. Otherwise we have a nice plan, but it will end up at the shelf. Now, for the investment planning, it's important to take into consideration the government's mode. Is what kind of type of good is it? Is it public? Is it private? For example, if we need water for a wetland, is that private? Should it be from the private sector? Are people going to pay to visit the wetland, or can everybody go there? So is it a common good because it also protects us from safety, from, for example, from the typhoon? So it can be also a common good. We have to take it into account to define our level of services. So what is it going to do now? What will be the level of service, for example, for water supply? And we have to come up with the financing and the procurement strategy. So what is the financing behind that measure? Last, an example of the implementation card. So to make really clear which institutions will be involved and what will be their role. This is an example of Cebu in the Philippines that we made. We spelled out which organization should take the initiative, who is providing permits, who is really implementing it. Is it an investment or is it public awareness? So is it green infrastructure? Is it gray infrastructure? What will be the cost and where is it implemented? So this can help to get an overview and present it to decision makers. In the end, the outcome of this phase is this action plan and implementation, and that should be monitored. So we also have to put it organizational in place. For example, by a technical secretariat that monitor and evaluate the progress, and if it's necessary, it steers ahead and improve the action plan, or maybe we go up again and start making a new plan or update the plan. So what I want to stress here at the end is that it's a circle process. It's continuous improving, and it's the same. It's not only for the plan, it's also for the framework. We have to adjust it and improve it for the next step. Then I came to the end of my presentation. So are there any questions still? Because it's already late, I understood. So, okay. 1 or 2 questions. So.
Somebody here
A lot of information.
in the Netherlands, a question, or maybe abroad, for the webinar?
No. Okay.
Then I have a question.
No.
If you look at the different phases, I think there's a lot of time to come to the that's needed to come to the all the phases. Which is the most difficult part, or the longest part?
Most time consuming.
Most time consuming. And what can you do about it to speed it up?
I think what you see is the inception phase to get agreement about what are the issues that are addressed, because in the beginning everybody is looking from their own point of view, and I think it takes time to grow together and to get really commitment to make this plan. And you don't know beforehand what comes out of it and if it will benefit your own sector. So in the beginning, everybody should agree upon how to proceed, and if the steps are clear, then you can go ahead, and then everybody will accept, if they are taken by hand, what comes out of the plan. It shouldn't be a surprise. So.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
No.
Then I would like to invite Marnix to take us into the world of the computational framework. An example of that.
Thank you, Edwin, and thank you, Judith. My name is Marnix van der Vat. I am working at Deltares as an hydroeconomist, and I have the honor to present as an example of a computational framework the work we are currently doing for the Ganga Basin. I am presenting, but of course the work is carried out by a very large group and a consortium which is led by Deltares, but also includes AECOM India and Future Water, consultancy company from the Netherlands. Please intervene during my presentation so that I can focus on what is most interesting to you. So if you have questions, you think I'm going too fast or I'm going too slow on some topics, please intervene. And also the people sitting not in this room, please intervene, and then Edward will give a sign and you will be given the chance to ask your question or comment. I will briefly introduce first the Ganga Basin to you and the project which we are executing there. And then I will go through the different topics that include the computational framework, or that the computational framework deals with. I've put questions and discussions at the end, but please also feel free to ask questions during the presentation, but we will keep the discussion till the end, I propose. The project has a very complicated and long title, Analytical Work and Technical Assistance to Support Strategic Basin Planning for the Ganga Basin. And the essence is that we are supporting a process, and we are not preparing the strategy, the plan, but we are supporting that. The client is the World Bank, and the counterpart that we work together with are different agencies, departments under the government of India. First of all, that's the Ministry of Water Resources, River Development and Ganga Rejuvenation. You see already in the title of the ministry how important the Ganga is for India. But also very important are the state level ministries of water. They have different names in different states. And they are very important for water management because India is a federal state. And the power to deal with water management lies at the state level, not at the central level. So the central level has a coordinating function, but the decisions have to be made between the different states, which of course complicates river basin management in such a huge basin. And finally, we are very important are different central level agencies who have more specific knowledge and who support the decision making. Well, this is a picture of the Ganga basin in India. So that is the first important limitation of the scope of the project. We focus only on India. And I think that was a strategic choice by the World Bank to start with India and not to include the whole of the basin. But of course, we need to include the upstream parts. The parts not in India is downstream in Bangladesh. Nepal is mostly within the basin and a part of China also. So those are included in the computational framework because, well, they have a lot of influence on the downstream part, but the model stops here at the Farakka barrage where the water flows into Ganga, into Bangladesh, and well, downstream here where a different branch flows into the Bay of Bengal. This is nice. And it works. It's huge. It's 860,000 square kilometers. Let's compare. The Netherlands is 40,000 square kilometers, so it's about 20 times the Netherlands. There are 11 states included, so because water management is dealt with at the state level, that requires a lot of coordination. And furthermore, there are 450 million people living in the Ganga basin. And that's also a lot. I've never worked in such a huge basin as the Ganga basin. The average flow is 525 billion cubic meters per year. If you compare, I think for the Nile, that is about just a bit more than 10% of that. And if you divide the number of the flow, the average flow by the number of inhabitants, you're around 1,000 million cubes, 1,000 cubes per capita per year, which is more or less the boundary for water stress. So that's already showing that in the current situation, there is already some water shortage, especially in years with El Nino induced droughts. There is already experienced shortage in the system, mostly in agriculture. But the expectation is that that will increase a lot in the future due to population growth and due to economic growth, which results in an increase of per capita water demand. The issues are not only on the water quantity, but very much also on water quality and ecology. Because a lot of water is taken out of the system, the rivers in the dry season become nearly dry and nearly completely filled with wastewater. India has a monsoonal climate with nearly all precipitation falling 2 months, and the rest of the year is very dry. There is not so much storage in the basin at the moment. So during the wet season, all gates are opened and the rivers are flushing. The other 9-10 months of the year, all gates are closed and there's hardly any flow in the main stem of the upper part of the Ganga. In this eastern part, there's much more water coming in, mainly from the Himalayas. So that results in water quality problems. Of course, they are also caused by a lack of wastewater treatment capacity. but also in ecological problems directly due to the water quality problems, but also related to the low flow, related to the loss of habitats for species, because the connections are lost along the river because of dams and gates, but also between the river and its floodplains. Well, the objectives of our study were fourfold, and the one we deal with today is mainly on the accessible information and knowledge. That's where the computational framework is important for, of course, but it's also related to the other three. The multi-stakeholder process, we very much included that into our model building by trying to be as collaborative as possible. And the final aim of the project is to define some plausible scenarios. So that's not the plan, but some future possibilities that could form the basis for further decision making by the government of India, the different actors. And finally, of course, to strengthen the capability of the different players to do strategic planning in the basin. The aim of the model of the computational framework within this whole setting is to support the decision making with respect to strategic basin planning. For this huge basin, it's impossible to make one model which includes all details. So it's for strategic basin planning, strategic decisions, so it has to be able to describe the impact of measures at basin level, but not detailed at local level. Now to the water system. Of course, before you model, you have to know what you want to model, and therefore you need to know more or less how the water system looks like. Of course, rainfall runoff is important. That's everywhere. What is rather specific for the Ganga Basin is the way the irrigation scheme works. It's the largest irrigation scheme in the world, and it is fed partly by gates which divert the water from the main rivers where they exit the Himalayas, and then it's diverted into huge canals like the Ganga Canal that was built hundreds of years ago already, its first form, and that diverts the surface water for irrigation. But nearly half of the irrigated area does not depend on surface water but on groundwater. So it's a conjunctive use system which uses both surface water and groundwater. And very important is that the canals especially have a very large leakage of water. That water is not lost because that goes into the first aquifer and then it's used again, pumped and used again mostly for irrigation but also of course for public water supply. So there is a recycling of water. And very important is the interaction with the river. The river flow is low because a lot of water is diverted from the river at some locations. But even if you would get more water in the dry season into the river, it depends on the groundwater level whether that water will stay in. Because if the groundwater level is too low, the river will drain into the aquifer again, and the water will be, well, it's not lost, it can be used again for irrigation, but you will lose it for the ecological function of the river downstream. So it's quite a complex system, which we had to describe into our computational framework. And this is the framework that we came up with RIBASIM with a central role, but first of all, hydrological models to describe the rainfall runoff process, the melt of the glaciers, melt of snow. So those calculate the queues, the discharges at different locations. The groundwater model, which describes, first of all, of course, the water levels of the groundwater levels based on recharge and on the abstraction rates. But also that is very important that they describe the interaction between the river and the groundwater. So how much water flows from the groundwater to the river and how much water flows back from the river to the groundwater. RibaSim takes care of all the water demands, the water allocation between the different demands, between the different users, and it calculates then the water demand also, which feeds into the groundwater model. Then connected to RibaSim is a water quality model, which describes the different concentrations of pollutants based on a database of emitters. And finally, an ecological module which uses expert rules, knowledge rules, to, based on the output of all the models, to derive a qualitative or semi-quantitative measure for the ecological state for different indicators of the river. So that could be the ability of the ecosystem to support the Ganga dolphin. And finally, there is the dashboard and the water information system, where all input data are stored, where all output of the different models are stored, that allows for the interaction between the models, but that also presents the information in the form of a dashboard where the indicators are presented. Now, if we think back to Judith's presentation, it's clear that this is mostly focused on the phase 2 and phase 3 of the framework, on the situation analysis, so how is the current situation, and on assessing the impacts of different strategies. And therefore, especially the dashboard is very important to compare different strategies with each other. But this is just to show that nearly all components are open source, except for RibaSim and Fuse, which are freeware components, and all other components can just be downloaded. Collaborative modeling was very important. We have had so far, I think this is all, we nearly have finished the third round of sessions in all of the 11 states to collect there the input in the first step, especially regarding what is important, how does the system function, so those kind of causal relations, but also what interventions do you think that are reasonable so that we could make strategies, and which indicators are important. And then you see that for different states, different indicators are important. Now, I will briefly introduce to you the different components of the computational framework with some emphasis on RibaSim. We've chosen to use two different models for the hydrology. The WFlow model, which is Deltares' generic hydrological modeling framework, where we did not include the groundwater part, because that's dealt with in IMOD, the groundwater model that we included. And with WFlow, we modeled most of the basin, except for the part where we used SPY. And SPY is a model that's developed by Future Water, and which is especially good in modeling glacier hydrology. So it includes much more than WFlow, the processes of glacier melt, snow melt, glacier accumulation, etc. And those are important in the upstream part of the Ganga. Although they are a bit less important than I initially expected, it appears that the Indus is much more dependent on glacier melt than the Ganga, if you look into the impact of future scenarios. Both models are completely, fully distributed models that work on a 1 by 1 kilometer grid in this case, and we used mostly input from global data sets, but where available, we replaced those by local data sets. For instance, the precipitation, the temperature, those were used, were provided by the Indian Meteorological Department for India, but of course the part outside India, we couldn't use those, so there we used global data sets like WFDEI. To the status of the models, maybe it's good to add that this model, modeling part is finished. We are still in the process of finalizing the whole system, and the next step, the groundwater step, is under construction still, so I cannot go in so much detail here. Again, a fully spatially distributed model. It is prepared in IMOD, which is Deltares' version and graphical interface around the well-known USGS ModFlow model. It's a large model, a large number of computational cells, over 1 million, with a time step of 1 month so that we can calculate longer periods. And that's the same time step that we also used in RibeSim. That's a very large time step if you look for flooding, for instance. But for water allocation, a time step of 1 month or 10 days is more or less also the time step with which you divide the water over the different users. So that's why we selected this time step, and that allows to make calculations for longer time series. The model boundary is different for the groundwater model than for the hydrological model, because groundwater is not important in the whole area, only in the alluvial. But if I say only, you see that that's most of the catchment. But within the mountainous areas to the south and the north, the groundwater flow and the groundwater storage is of limited importance. And this is the way that we prepared the schematization, the underground model, by taking those very nice cross sections that were available and putting them in the IMOD model, and then constructing the layers that go through the different profiles. This is an interactive process. It looks very complicated here, but it looks really smooth if you work with the IMOD interface. Then to the RibeSim model. RibeSim schematizes this whole grid of 1 by 1 kilometer cells in a network of links and nodes, and well, we will hear more about this later today. The input of water to RibeSim is what has been calculated by the hydrological models by WFlow and SPI. And then RibeSim adds to that the calculation every time step of the water demand for the different users, and the allocation of water if there is a shortage based on priorities that we have defined. A calibration took place based on, of course, flows, but also on the amount of water that was allocated to the different users. The input data were, of course, mostly local. A lot of them were statistical data at district level, like the amount of the irrigated area, the different crops that were grown in each of the districts. However, there were 283 districts, if I remember correctly, and that is a bit too much to keep an overview as modeler, but especially as decision maker. So we aggregated that into 38 irrigation areas, which, well, is sufficient to describe the strategic implications on the basin level, but it's not enough to look at one specific irrigation area, one district, and focus what's happening there. That would require more detailed modeling. And of course, a lot of other, mostly local data sources, and very important, the Water Resources Information System of India that was that has been set up by the Central Water Commission, which provides a lot of information about reservoirs, capacities, etc. The schematization consists of what we call variable inflow nodes, where the outcome of the hydrological models flows into the RibeSim model. Reservoirs, where water is stored. Barrages, where water is diverted. Water demand nodes that are linked to both the groundwater and the surface water to describe the conjunctive use. And public water supply nodes that describe urban, rural, and industrial water demand. And it looks like this, which looks at the first phase very complicated, but if you look in more detail, it's quite easy to understand. It's generated semi-automatically, the schematization. The whole basis with the sub-basin structure and the links that connect the different sub-basins from W-flow is taken over automatically, and then manually the water use and the barrages, reservoirs have been added. You see some very large arrows that point right across the whole basin. Those are inter-basin transfer links that are not yet active, but they have been already included because they will form part of the strategies that we are going to evaluate with this system. And those are proposed already for 20 years in different versions and discussed within India. So it's important to assess their impact on the water flows, but also on the water quality and the ecology. An important part of the whole system is the efficiency of irrigation water use and what happens with the water that is not used by the plant, that's not transpired by the plants. First, to the efficiency, well, we did not do any research on that ourselves, of course, but from literature, you'll find that for surface water, the irrigation efficiency in the Ganga basin is about 40%, and for groundwater, around 70%. The difference is explained by the fact that the large canals which bring the water from the rivers to the irrigation schemes, the primary canals, they leak very much. So that explains the low percentage of 40%. On the other hand, as I explained, that water is not lost. It's going into the aquifer and it can be used for groundwater irrigation later on. Very important in the system is what happens to the water. So most of the water, more than half of the water which goes into the surface water irrigation canals is not being transpired by the plant. So either it evaporates, then it's lost, or it infiltrates into the groundwater, or it flows off back into the surface water system. And well, based on literature, we estimated that by far the largest part drains into the groundwater. And within this large irrigation scheme, there are areas where this has led to too high groundwater levels, causing salinization. And in other parts, the recharge of the groundwater is much less than the abstraction rates, and groundwater levels are dropping a lot. Overall, groundwater levels are getting lower in most of, especially the western part of the system. But to calibrate this whole complex system, we have to bring together the results of W-flow and Ribesim, because W-flow does not describe the water management, the water use and the reservoirs. That's only done in Ribesim. But in Ribesim, very important is, of course, the water use also. So the first assumption was that in an average year, there are currently no major shortages. And that is stated by the stakeholders. And that would mean that the demands that we calculate within Ribesim should be met. Well, that is something which we will see in how far that happens. And furthermore, of course, we looked into other assessments of how much groundwater is abstracted, so that we do not use twice as much. And we compared simulated with measured river flows as far as possible. And the last one is important. In our model, the allocation priority is strictly that domestic comes before industrial, comes before irrigation. But of course, as nearly always, by far the largest part, around 80%, is in irrigation. Now first, the comparison between simulated and reported, assessed by others, by the Central Groundwater Board, groundwater abstractions. In the model, those are determined by two things: the amount of capacity installed to abstract the groundwater in the model, and the water demand by irrigation. And you see that this is for the public water supply, that's more or less the same. But for irrigation, we overestimate slightly the amount of water abstracted. And this is what you see internationally in a lot of situations, that there appears to be some inconsistency between the data on reported areas of irrigated crops, and then if you calculate the water demand from that and you compare that to the water that is actually supplied, in most of the situations there is more water demanded than can be supplied. And that could be that a limited amount of shortage is accepted as normal, but also it could be that the statistically reported acreages for different crops are a bit overestimated. And this is a comparison. I'm hoping the colors are for you visible. For me, they are not really. Comparison between simulated and observed for Varanasi, which is about halfway downstream on the Ganga. It was the most downstream location for which we had measurements. And you see that there is a huge difference seasonally, of course. It's a monsoon climate. And you see that the model describes quite well normally the seasonal fluctuation. That is more specifically shown below. But that there are also quite some differences which are relevant, but not so much that they make the use of the model impossible. The left side, by the way, is the calibration period of 14 years, and the right side is a 10 years validation period. And of course, it's important to remember with all those applications that we make that we describe the actual state of the system with respect to water infrastructure and water demand, and only the meteorological time series is varied over this period. So especially for the 1985-1995 period, the water demand and the infrastructure would have been different. Well, then to the water quality model, that's also still under completion. Of course, it describes the concentrations of different substances, polluting substances, and it's important to get the knowledge what is causing my problem, but also to see what the interventions could do. And well, we included agriculture as an important source, of course. Point sources are mainly wastewater treatment plants or direct emission of untreated wastewater, human wastewater, and industrial wastewater. This shows some preliminary results for biological oxygen demand along the Ganga River, the average over 4 years. And you see that, well, there is a lot of variation which is partly explained and partly not explained by the model. And that has to do always with the incompleteness of the emission inventory. It can never be complete, but it can always be better. But overall, the level of the simulated and measured concentrations are the same. We have done, of course, the simulation for different substances, and that would be too much information for anyone to grasp. So luckily, there is a water quality indicator defined in India, which is normally applied, which is based on different parameters, and we use that to combine the results of the simulations into one indicator. Finally, the knowledge rules for the ecology, which is always, well, always, I think it was the first time that we really included it explicitly in a computational framework to try to quantify the impact on the ecology, quantify it in a qualitative way, because we cannot calculate how many dolphins you will have in the different scenarios. But what we can calculate is an indicator, for instance, on a range of 1 to 5, how well the habitat suits the dolphins, based on the results of the models, on criteria like the discharge, but related to the discharge also the connectivity between the river and the floodplains, and between different river segments, and the results of the water quality modeling regarding the different pollutants. No results yet, unfortunately, because especially the knowledge rules are very difficult to get. The system is ready to do it, but we are still having workshops with Indian experts to derive those knowledge rules. Then to the water information system and the dashboard. All data are stored there, all input data, all output data, and everyone has access to it. So that's the common platform of knowledge that we want to create. Well, this is more a technical part about which software is used. It's open source, not all components, of course. You can view it using Esri software, but also using open source QGIS software. And important is this dashboard where we try to present the impact of different strategies on a selected number of indicators. It looks like this, a preliminary version. You can select different geographical scopes, so the whole Ganga basin this is, but you could also zoom into one state, not further because it's not detailed enough for that. And this provides, for instance, the minimum flow along the Ganga and the water quality index, how it develops. And in this scorecard, that resembles the scorecard that Judith presented for different indicators. Unfortunately, in the scope of this project, socio-economy was not included. So it's, but we try to get as close as possible. So there is not the value of the agricultural production, but there is the area which has no water limitation on its agricultural production. So it's close to economically, those are economically relevant indicators, but they are not directly a measure of welfare. Finally, the water information system, which stores all the data and which really could help to share, because in India we see that different states, different institutes have their own information systems, and it's very difficult to exchange between those. So we hope that this can form a platform for exchanging information and also exchanging ideas about what types of measures to do and what their impacts are. Well, just some pictures of the types of information. Very important also, of course, time series information, where we can also do the comparison of model results with measurements and the comparison of different strategies. Finally, the current status. The project is not finished yet. The contract extends into 2018. The model is completed for some parts. Other parts are under calibration at the moment. And the scenarios have been prepared to be evaluated with the computational framework. And those are scenarios relating to climate change, relating to socio-economic effects, especially population growth, of course, but also an increase in irrigated area. And different management strategies will be evaluated that look at, for instance, increased wastewater treatment, increased water use efficiency, very important also different operation of current infrastructure, but also on new infrastructure like new reservoirs, but also those IBTLs, the interbasin transfer links that can be evaluated with this. I thank you very much for your attention.